Welcome back to another episode on anti-Semitism in English literature. In our last episode, we looked at early modern playwrights such as William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe. Today, we'll be talking about the Victorian period, with a special focus on Charles Dickens. But before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe. So, what was going on for Jews in England at this time? To understand the big picture, we'll have to go back a little. Following the Edict of Expulsion issued by Edward I in 1290, the few Jews left in England were converts to Christianity. Over the subsequent centuries, minuscule numbers of Jews are recorded as having been present in England, but they had to hide their Jewishness. In the 17th century, their numbers continued to grow, and by the 18th century, this small community was an open and formal part of English society. By the 19th century, there was once again a strong Jewish presence in England. In the year 1830, 20 to 30,000 Jews lived in the country. By 1880, the community had doubled in size to 60,000. Still, when Queen Victoria ascended to the throne, Jews continued to face many challenges. They were not allowed to open shops in London, be called to the bar, receive university degrees, or sit in Parliament. Limited in what they could do, many earned their living by buying and selling old clothes, peddling, and money-lending. And yet the picture was not as bleak as before. Over time, England reformed, and Jews' freedoms increased. In 1858, the first Jewish MP, Lionel de Rothschild, was elected and the Jewish Disabilities Act passed, a major step towards social emancipation. Then, in 1871, the Universities Tests Act permitted Jews to attend and work at the universities of Oxford, Cambridge, and Durham. Beyond the law, people's attitudes also softened, with greater numbers of Englishmen viewing Jews sympathetically as the Victorian period drew to a close. The life and work of Charles Dickens reflects this historical journey. From his wildly anti-Semitic portrayal of Fagin in Oliver Twist to his generous depiction of Mr. Riah in Our Mutual Friend, his thinking changed significantly between the 1830s and the 1860s. Dickens is widely regarded as the greatest author of the Victorian period. Today, most people remember him for his powerful social critiques, for novels such as A Christmas Carol and Great Expectations. Dickens himself was an ardent philanthropist, spending much of his free time pursuing social reform and the alleviation of poverty. And yet, for all his kindness, his overtly anti-Semitic writing prompted a baffled journalist at the Jewish Chronicle to question why Jews alone should be excluded from the sympathizing heart of this great author and powerful friend of the oppressed. An echo of the modern question, why don't Jews count? Oliver Twist was published serially from 1837 to 1839. The novel dedicates many passages to the demonization of Fagin, the vile criminal mastermind and notorious miser who schools young boys in pickpocketing. Throughout, he is referred to simply as the Jew. Fagin is first introduced in the most unapologetically anti-Semitic of ways, as a very shriveled old Jew whose villainous-looking and repulsive face is obscured by a quantity of matted red hair. Physically revolting, immediately objectionable, Fagin's red hair only adds to the picture of him as something creaturely or demonic. At this time, red hair on a Jew typically symbolized the eternal flames of hell. Fagin is forever rubbing his hands, a sinister vulture on the sidelines, the infernal, rich, plundering, thundering old Jew, around whom the plot is constructed. Chapter 19 is particularly eye-opening. Here is how it begins. It was a chill, damp, windy night when the Jew emerged from his den. The mud lay thick upon the stones, and a black mist hung over the streets. The rain fell sluggishly down, and everything felt cold and clammy to the touch. It seemed just the night when it befitted such a being as the Jew to be abroad. As he glided stealthily along, creeping beneath the shelter of the walls and doorways, the hideous old man seemed like some loathsome reptile, engendered in the slime and darkness through which he moved, crawling forth by night in search of some rich offal for a meal. Dickens' description of his Jewish antagonist as a loathsome reptile conjures images of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, implicitly associating Fagin with Satan and his evil cunning. The relationship between Fagin and Oliver is also steeped in anti-Semitic tropes. Dickens writes, In short, the wily old Jew had the boy in his toils. He was now slowly instilling into his soul the poison which he hoped would blacken it and change its hue forever. This language borrows from centuries-old anti-Jewish rhetoric. In the medieval period, Jews were frequently accused of well poisoning, and this idea remained part of the public imagination for a long while afterwards. It is therefore unsurprising that Oliver Twist angered a great many English Jews. Eliza Davis, a Jewish mother of 10, wrote to Dickens personally in 1863, condemning him for having encouraged a vile prejudice against the despised Hebrew. She continued, "Fagin, I fear, admits only of one interpretation. But while Charles Dickens lives, the author can justify himself or atone for a great wrong." At first, Eliza's comments fell on deaf ears. However, after she wrote again and insisted on the offensiveness of the work, Dickens began to think. Before the 1867 reprint, he quickly tried to edit out countless references to Fagin as the Jew. Later in life, he also created what some critics refer to as the anti-Shylock, in the character of the kind, charitable Jew, Mr. Riah, in Our Mutual Friend. Eliza later credited him with having exercised the noblest quality man can possess, that of atoning for an injury as soon as one is conscious of having inflicted it. Unfortunately, much of the damage had already been done. The dreadful Jew, Fagin, ringleader of the thieves, exploiter of children, was out in the open, a popular caricature. One of Dickens' contemporaries, Georges de Maurier, also contributed to anti-Semitic stereotypes with his 1894 novel Trilby. The plot is as follows. Trilby O'Farrell, a young model in Paris, falls under the spell of a Jewish hypnotist and musician called Svengali. He uses his powers to control her, forcefully propelling Trilby into a career as a singer. When Svengali dies, the spell breaks and she loses her magical voice. The novel, in which Svengali is compared to a big, hungry spider, reinforced a latent fear of the Jewish puppet master, an old fabrication. Du Maurier also included some of his own illustrations in Trilby, one of which featured Svengali the spider in his web. Over a century later, anti-Semitic caricatures in Nazi propaganda regularly depicted Jews as spiders. Today, Svengali is still in use as a derogatory term. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, a Svengali is a person who exercises a controlling or mesmeric influence on another, especially for a sinister purpose. As you can see, Victorian literature has much to atone for. Although 19th century fiction moved away from blood libel and other antiquated tropes, it still featured considerable anti-Semitic imagery. That brings us to the end of another episode on anti-Semitism in English literature. Stay tuned for our next segment on modernist poets and 20th century authors. See you next time.